You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer. Welcome, you're listening to Jay's Analysis. Tonight we return to the Republic, and we recap and conclude this most famous text of the history of Western philosophy, Plato's Republic. We have seen quite a bit back from part one when we began analyzing the idea of the ideal state. And we saw from the outset that Plato believed quite confidently that you could erect a rational state, and that the rational state would be based on the notion of the forms. And so his metaphysic and his epistemology are going to inform his doctrine of the polis, or the state, or the Kallipolis. We saw that it was not a democracy, that a democracy is one of the worst forms of government in the mind of Plato and Socrates, but rather that it's a kind of hierarchy, but it's not a hierarchy based strictly on the notion of bare authority. Rather, it's ruled by what we saw was a sort of hierarchy of the guardians above the masses, and then above the guardians, the philosopher kings. And we saw that this was after a long process of lifelong education, where the best stock would be chosen early on and then be trained basically all throughout their life to enter into the training of the guardian and then of the philosopher king. Now the needs of the city are going to be determined and guided by this philosophical elite. They will even be in charge of controlling the population. The elite philosophers will choose the wisest rules across the board for the Kallipolis, the ideal city. We saw Plato's doctrine of knowledge, of course, is tied intimately into the notion of the forms, and that the forms will then inform what is the form of the city. That is, what is in other words, the principles of, say, mathematics and geometry, quantification, are going to be the underlying presuppositions also for how to construct the perfectly formed geometric state, so to speak. It is an elitist position, and in Socrates and Plato's mind, of course, it is based on even still the common good. So it's not a completely tyrannical notion in Plato's mind, at least, to have things like breeding regulations and eugenics, and that's explicit, of course, in Book 4 of the Republic. In Plato's mind, this was necessary to have everything in balance, right? To have good proportion and form. We saw that the state also had the role of creating and controlling the mythos, the religious mythology of the Republic. And as we're going to see in the conclusion tonight, I'm going to give a more extensive treatment on exactly what's going on in Plato's doctrine of the myth of the Kallipolis, the noble lie, so to speak. And we're going to see that there is, in fact, a mystery religion element to Plato. Now, we've seen that hinted at in Book 3 with the noble lie and the ring of Gyges, right? The mysterious magical ring that is a mythological secret that will underlie the religious beliefs of the Republic. But we're also going to see that No, there's more to that. In fact, the Ring of Gyges will return, as well as the myth of in this most important book 10, the conclusion of the Republic. We'll get to that in a moment. We saw, of course, that the tripartite soul was an image of the triadic form of the government in the Republic. So you have, of course, levels of virtue in the soul. The three highest virtues, right? And we think of like Paul, faith, hope, and love, right, in the Bible. Well, there's a kind of Platonic version of these things where Plato talks about reason, spirit, and appetite, where the parts of the soul, the highest part is, of course, the reason. The next would be the spirit, and the lowest would, of course, be the appetite. Appetite corresponding to bodily desires, spirit corresponding to spirited desires, courage, etc. And then, of course, reason being the highest place as the faculty of the mind. And so the body, as an emblem of this, with the head at the top, the heart corresponding to the spirited virtues, and then the appetite corresponding to the bodily desires, is arranged in a kind of natural hierarchy for Plato, as we saw. We saw as well that this triadic hierarchy also applies to the approach to knowledge that Plato has. And so there's levels to how we can construct reasoning too. So within these triads, there are little triads, so to speak. And we saw that with the understanding corresponding to the highest level, noesis, or the nous. In Plato's thought, the nous is, of course, intellect and reasoning. Discursive thought and reasoning is the middle level, and that corresponds to reason, logic, mathematics. And then, of course, the lowest level being belief and imagination, pistis and ikasia, which are perhaps right, perhaps wrong. And, of course, this will go to inform Plato's understanding of why the poets have to be censored in the Republic, which we'll get to in Book 10. We saw that the sun is to the visible realm as the good is to the intelligible realm. So there's two realms in Plato, a kind of dualism, realm of the forms, and then the realm of shadows, phenomena, appearance, and so forth, the material realm. Math, of course, as we said, is the model. And so there's, of course, mandatory mathematical training on your path towards becoming a philosopher king. Geometry is crucial. Numbers are the clearest way, in Plato's mind, to show the distinction between the one and the many. And the one and the many is that perennial philosophical question, and especially Western philosophy, and I guess you could argue ultimately in Eastern philosophy as well, with if you do some research on the yin-yang, right? The yin-yang, and the different dualities and so forth, and the transcending of duality that goes into the Far Eastern notion of the yin-yang. There's an interesting book I've read on that by an Asian guy. I forget his name off the top of my head, but The Trinity in Asian Perspective, which deals with the yin and the yang from a Far Eastern perspective and its relationship to the triad or the Trinity. I would not recommend that, guys. I recommend it in the sense of, if you're interested in it, Trinity in Asian Perspective. But I don't adhere to his ideas. He's pretty far out there, and it seems to be a kind of Rockefeller-funded liberal type book. But there's some interesting ideas there that would relate to Platonism. So that's the kind of mechanics and diagram, if you will, of Plato's ontology. And we saw in Book 7 that this is where the famous allegory of the cave comes into play, with the notion of through noetic light, through enlightenment, through the forms. This is how one escapes the cave. So you'll notice that in a lot of argumentation that I do, especially when I'm arguing with a lot of these people who are have really bought into like the Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, Sam Harris kind of materialism, I'm generally trying to take roughly a similar approach to pointing out how mathematical concepts and entities, integers, conceptual realities show themselves to be, by the very nature of what they are, invariant, immaterial, and not bound to time and matter. And so they're not merely human social constructs. If they were, they would differ from culture to culture. But as it stands, we can read Plato and use the same geometry that Plato uses, right? So geometry is not a social construct. It's not a word game that the Pythagoreans sat around and came up with. It's a reflection of spiritual and eternal principles. And I think that that's very true. And that shows in contrast to the positivists, the nominalists, the materialists, the empiricists, etc., 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 basically the moderns of our day, that their perspective at its very outset is incorrect. And that's why the rest of their philosophy is so screwed up. But they begin with presuppositions and assumptions, things such as, that all that exists is physical. The physicalism is all there is. Reductionism, that is the starting point. And so you'll see them pull this little sleight of hand when they discuss science, and science is always defined in terms of what is physically the case, right? Physicalism, physical explanations. And then they'll turn around and say that science is the best explanation or approach to how to understand the world. So they pull a sleight of hand where they are telling you that physical explanations, that equals science. Science equals the best explanation for what happens in the world, and the only explanation. And science, therefore, equals materialism and physicalism. And you see this all the time. But that is not the case. So they don't ever question their presuppositions, and that's why I always question the presuppositions. That's where I begin, because I have a different starting point and different presupposition. And it's from presuppositions that we build our worldviews. And if you want to hear more on that, I have a talk that you can go back to on YouTube called Introduction to Transcendental Arguments, where I outline that more extensively. We saw that in Plato, book 7, that he's a kind of philosophic martyr, so to speak, especially Socrates, as we saw in the Apology. And the noetic light of the intelligible sun deifies the philosopher. It brings him closer to the realm of the forms, and because the philosopher has kinship with the forms, he has less kinship with becoming. So the realm of reality that we inhabit in Platonism is the realm of becoming. It's always changing, it's always in flux. And those who are in the cave are attached to the realm of becoming. So it's no surprise that you have philosophers like Hitchens and so forth, Dawkins, who would only see flux and change and evolution and chaos as the highest principle in the universe, because that's what they're attached to, and that is the presupposition of their worldview, that that's all that exists. You'll have to forgive me, this is allergy season. Now, that presupposition has to be questioned, though. And one way, as I've outlined many times, that we can show that that's false is to point out that the scientific method, which is merely a tool, is not itself an explanation of anything. Right? Science is a method for gaining knowledge about the natural world, and so as a tool, as an inductive tool that also uses deduction, by the way, there's no way that it by the very nature of what it is, can be expanded to try to give grand narrative explanations for what's going on in the world, and for origins science, and for engineering science, etc., etc. But that is in fact what the hucksters and scamsters try to do when they take a tool, the scientific method, and then turn around and say it's actually a worldview that tells you everything about how the cosmos came to be through the Big Bang, and how life came to be through aeons of gradual evolution, gradualism, transformism, as well as everything else, all the way up into possibly even Space Brothers, seeding us here with panspermia and Dawkins, and then even into transhumanism. So what you start to notice is that, oh wait, this is actually an entire worldview that functions much more like a religion than, quote, science. So ironically, it's actually persons like myself who are interested in the philosophy of science who are much better scientists than persons like Dawkins. Because what they're doing isn't really science, it's actually scientific lingo that is used as window dressing for an alternate religious philosophy. And that religious philosophy is ironically quite similar to ancient Greek mythological and Hindu mythological views of the origins of the universe. Right? Aeons and aeons of gradual evolutionary flux and change. And, if you look at the standard kind of we're all muck, and the lightning bolt strikes the muck and it gives birth to the original forms of life and so forth, cellular forms, protozoa, etc. That is quite similar to an Orphic myth where Zeus strikes the ground with a thunderbolt to punish the Titans. And this is what gives rise to the accidental creation of humans in the ancient Greek myth. So what Dawkins is telling you is science is actually ancient Greek mythology, which I would reject out of hand. Now, we're not here, however, to talk evolution, but it's important to point out that that's the reason that I talk about this kind of stuff, is because it's kind of a window into what I think is true. So, we can think about, in Plato's mind, numbers and geometrical forms having a kind of eternal, atemporal, outside of time and space existence, and the fact that they don't change and they've always been the same. And you can talk about things like infinity, or you can talk about things like a Mandelbrot set, right? This shows that number is eternal and not subject to change and evolution and flux like the physical world is. And so in Plato's mind, that's much closer to true being, right? True existence, true reality. Whereas this world is subject to constant becoming, flux, and change. And it's being caught up in this world that leads us to follow the phantasms on the wall of the cave, like the people that are trapped. We saw that this was connected to Pythagorean mysteries that Plato was inducted into. We're going to touch on that more. Numerology and so forth. We saw Plato having an esoteric doctrine of the number of man that related to astrology. This is dealt with in more detail in the Timaeus, the Platonic cosmological and cosmogony, myth of origins, which we will deal with in the future as well. But we saw that Book 8 is similar to Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, because it deals with regimes and how most people think that morals arise from kind of whatever the elite dictate, or that's a kind of Nietzschean idea that that Plato kind of touches on in this talk, but we've already dealt with that, so we won't go back to that. And when we talked about Plato's discussion of democracy and how it's chaotic, and kind of one of the worst forms of government that leads to tyranny by the oligarchy. And so the four possible states that we saw Plato list, democracy, republic, and so forth, oligarchy, correspond to four different types of persons that were interlocutors throughout the dialogue. And so different persons throughout the republic represent these four different types of government. We saw that most people are motivated by pleasure and pain, and that few people seek out justice and are equipped for this, which is one of the highest, as we said, kind of the Platonic hierarchy of virtues. Justice is up there at the top. And so really the republic is kind of aimed, I guess you could say, at the philosopher kings, because ultimately the philosopher kings are really only going to be the ones that understand it appropriately. And then, of course, we have the discussions of, well, how realistic is it to think that this could be enacted? And Plato understands all that. He doesn't think necessarily that you're going to achieve any kind of perfection on on Earth, but he thinks that it's entirely incumbent upon people to, shoot for the ideal, I guess you could say. And that's going to come into play when we discuss the later doctrine of Plato embodied in his famous book, The Laws, which was written later on in life, years after the Republic, where Plato kind of modifies a few things. I guess he grew older and gained some more perspective, where he will alter some of his doctrines that he proposed in the Republic, and things take on a little more of a pragmatic turn. So in the Republic, you're dealing with a lot of mythology, metaphysics, and what we're going to see in the Laws is something more practical in the form of the Nocturnal Council, which will govern the fictional city of Magnesia. But for now, we're going to focus on Book 10 and deal with what the conclusion of the Republic is, as we've seen this recap here. The conclusion of the Republic is that epics of Homer, which of course had, prior to Plato, dominated, I guess you could say, the tradition of the Greeks, embodied in the oral poetry of Homer, passed down orally. And in Plato's mind, it's got to be censored because the ignorant man promotes ignorance. And what we need is a new hero, a new Achilles. But rather than the new hero being a man of battle, according to Plato, the new hero is a man of knowledge. And so the goal here is to prefer logos to mythos. So mythos, of course, being the Homeric writings, logos being the actions of philosophy, dialectic, as we saw, which was important throughout the Republic and the other dialogues as the means by which the philosopher gets to the truth, this process of dialectic. And in this sense, what we mean by dialectic is, argument, discourse, debate, getting at the truth. So since we're going to prefer logos to mythos, the written word has to be cautioned. So it's the Homeric heroes, of course, are in Hades, and of course reincarnation is what's taught. But what's going to happen here is that you're going to have a reformation of sorts, where almost Plato, he's almost presenting himself as the master of both mythos and logos, because you'll notice the Republic is full of myths, right? So Plato gives his commentary on all the myths, and so what he's doing is he's placing himself not just as a kind of master of the myths, but also as the master philosopher via Socrates, and so therefore he's fulfilling that dual role that he's set out as what needs to be fulfilled. And this, he thinks, is the way into the future. So, Homer's ideals, according to Plato, are somewhat bestial. Right? You've got all this bloodshed and war and all this stuff, and that there's a higher way in Plato's mind. So Socrates is going to be in this position to discuss the kind of poetry that human beings should be permitted in the ideal state. And this discussion was mentioned earlier in book 3. It was kind of postponed, but now it's going to be picked up again. And so the question of music and poetry and physical training re-emerge with the issue of where to place Homer and Hesiod in terms of education, because the Republic is kind of a pedagogy, right? It's about how we're going to train up the leaders of the ideal state. So the new philosophy-based education will confront the traditional education that was based on poetry. And here, as we said, it's going to replace the former. So if poetry, in Plato's mind, is actually third from the arts, so to speak, or the crafts. So it's imitative, but you have, so at the top you might have the king, and then below him would be the craftsman, and below him would be the poet. So the king, ideally, as the philosopher king, is the most familiar with all the subjects and fields, and he's closer to the forms and therefore more universal. So he's able to imitate, mimesis, imitation, the forms. He imitates them and thereby participates in the forms in a kind of deification. Now below him is the craftsman, who doesn't really understand the forms, but he's, or the guardians perhaps, underneath the philosopher kings, but they're a better imitation than the poet, because they at least are operating in terms of some craft, right? In the sense of building a bridge or whatever. That is an imitation of the geometry that's used, or so an engineer, okay, is closer to the forms than a poet in Plato's mind. Now the poet is induced by a kind of enthusiasm or inspiration, and this is why it's a little less rational, so to speak, right? He's using passion. He's not focused on math, geometry, and order and form, generally speaking. I guess some poets could be, but in Plato's mind, in terms of Homer, this is what he's dealing with. He's not dealing with Shakespearean sonnets and meter and so forth. So the poets can influence the masses, right? Because poetry is popular through their song and through their dance and through their lyric. And it can then be a powerful form of propaganda that can incite revolution. And that's why it has to be censored. Now, that may sound outlandish and foreign to so-called American freedoms, but it kind of makes sense if you look at the 60s counterculture and the British invasion and the music of, say, the Laurel Canyon scene. If you've read Dave McGowan's book, that it does seem to be engineered to create a kind of countercultural revolution. And that had the effect of, in part, throwing off the older, traditional, conventional morals and taboos. Now, even if you think that was good, I don't think it's debatable that is the case. And Plato is talking about that very thing. So the poets have to be censored and have to be watched, and you can't just let them do whatever they want, because they'll incite anarchy because they appeal to baser passions. Right? Think about rap. Okay, rap music is more of a base form of music that appeals to the baser desires that is quite different in form, function, and effect than something like Beethoven or orthodox liturgical chant. These are very different forms and obviously have very different effects. Think of the Rolling Stones, right? The Altamont incident, if that was real. So, as we said, Plato then is placing himself as the master of mythos and logos to combine the two and, of course, place logos as preeminent. And we saw that the one and the many was very important because that relates to form and copy. And that's what mimesis is all about. And the poets, it's time for them to step down. It's time for, in Plato's mind, for reason to trump the arts. And, reason in Plato is, again, what relates to logic and the forms, and mathematics and geometry, right? All those things are kind of the same. So we have some interesting discussions in Book 10 about, again, the arts being dangerous. And it's dangerous because it has an emotional appeal, right? So the arts can appeal to everyone's emotions and thus mass manipulate by shutting off the reason. So you're moved by what you see, feel, and hear in the plays and in the songs and in the dance and in the lyrics. And you're not focused on rational thought, and you're much more easily manipulable, right? Now we immediately think again of pop music, of the CIA and its manipulations through advertising, the funding of abstract modernist art, right? These are all examples of this principle laid out in Plato. Now, another reason Plato thinks that these myths have to be censored is because of the immoral presentations of the gods. And Plato, of course, wants to promote reason, order, harmony, and piety as he sees it. And you can't do that when you've got Zeus raping Hera and raping his daughters. So these immoral stories have to be nixed. So philosophers like even Xenophanes and Heraclitus attacked Homer and Hesiod as well for the immoral tales of the gods. So Plato's not the first to do this. Poets even, such as Aristophanes, in response attacked philosophers precisely for subverting this traditional ethic of Homeric tradition. So there's kind of a latent battle, warfare going on between the poets and the philosophers. So we could think of maybe, I don't know, some sort of engineer or mathematician having an argument with Eddie Vedder. I don't know, right? Like who's wiser in this scenario? I would think that probably at least as one gets older, the engineer has probably more wisdom than Eddie Vedder does. But if you're 18, you probably think Eddie Vedder's way cooler than an engineer. But that's why you can't have the youth, right, sort of running things and having their passions manipulated by the poets or by oligarchs or whatever. That's, of course, what we see happening in revolutions, is the manipulation of the mob's passions. So we have discussions again of the soul being immortal and the body being somewhat bad or evil, right? Some lesser ontological status for the body. And that's, of course, typical of the Greeks, typical of ancient religions in general, and typical of Platonism. And that's another important thing that, of course, sets, say, biblical or Christian theology and philosophy over against Platonism, is that it's quite the opposite, right? We have belief in the resurrection, which when Paul goes to preach to the Greeks at Athens in Acts 17, Paul presents the resurrection, which is, of course, the central hinge of the Christian religion, embodied in the resurrection of Christ. And, of course, the Greeks all think that this is laughable and foolish, right? Now, why did they think that? Well, because they were all studied in Plato, what we're talking about. And this is why Paul says in Acts 17, he says that he appeals to the unknown God, right? Which is at the hill of the philosophers there, where they're all debating, and Paul says, here you've got a statue to all these gods, and I see one extra statue here that you've made to the unknown God, because you think that you need to show piety in case you forgot one. And he says, I proclaim to you the one that you've forgotten, the one true God. So Paul doing a little bit of clever apologetics there in Acts 17, but it's relevant because if we look in book 10 here, we have this discussion of the soul being immortal set over against the body in a kind of dialectical tension, where the body is a prison that has to be escaped from. Why? Well, again, because this realm is all evil and bad. Quite the opposite in the classic Christian teaching, embodied in the Orthodox theology, of the notion of all of creation being restored through the resurrection. Right? So this is discussed in Romans 8, where Paul talks about all of creation being restored through the redemption of the sons of God in the resurrection. And this is, of course, called the Transfiguration. Now, that is antithetical to Greek thought and Greek philosophy. So, interesting contrast there. And Egyptologist Wim van den Dungen, whom I've cited many times, also points out the interesting contrast between Egyptian theology and Hellenic theology and philosophy, right? Because the Egyptians did not have this Greek view about the evilness, badness, lesserness, so to speak, of the body. Interesting. Where this came from, I would guess that given, as we look through these different dialogues in the Republic, and we see the teaching of transmigration of souls, or panpsychism, or metempsychosis, or reincarnation, that we see Far Eastern influences, right? Of a kind of Hindu type, so to speak. So perhaps Far Eastern thought is more has a higher place in Platonism than does Egypt in Egyptian mysteries. Although it is in the Timaeus that Plato says, Socrates got his doctrine from the Egyptians. He did not apparently get his doctrine of the body from the Egyptians, because we know, of course, the Egyptians believed in the resurrection. My guess would be, by the way, that the Egyptians believed in the resurrection precisely because of what's described in Genesis, where Joseph, and then, of course, later Moses, sojourned in Egypt. And they would have, of course, believed in the resurrection. And so that's perhaps where the Egyptians learned of the doctrine of the resurrection. And if you remember, Joseph, of course, is raised up to being next to Pharaoh in terms of power. So Joseph would have had a lot of power in Egypt if you read the book of Genesis. And conceivably, that's where the Egyptians would have derived the doctrine of the resurrection. That's a much better thesis than what I hear from the secular so-called scholars. Now, next we come to this curious tale where Plato's going to return to mythology, called the story of or the myth of And this is really fascinating stuff. Who is What is this all about? Well, is going to be a story that's an account of the cosmos and the afterlife. And so, not so much the elaborate cosmology of the Timaeus, but more so afterlife. And it's interesting that that's included here at the 10th book, the end of the Republic. And so what we have here is dies in battle. And so this is going to be kind of hinted at. It's hinting at books 9 through 11 of the Odyssey. So Plato's going to use the story from Homer to talk about the his explanation of what goes on in the afterlife in his view, and how we can learn from this story how virtue and justice, right, that important question that was put on hold from book 3, is important mainly because there is an afterlife, and you're going to have to deal with the consequences of your actions in the afterlife, and of course how it's going to relate to reincarnation in his view. So 2 days later, after this guy who dies in battle, this guy named in one of these Homeric battles, he revives on his funeral pyre, and he tells the story of his journey into the afterlife, and it's going to include his account of reincarnation, his ascent through the celestial spheres to the astral plane. The tale includes the idea that there are rewards and punishments, of course, after death. And he's going to tell how this comes about and how he was able to get back, because he did not drink the waters of Lethe, which is what causes you to forget when you return to this life. Interesting. So we're going to get deep into the classic mythology of Hades and what goes on down there. So the question of mythology and the myth of and we're talking about the waters of forgetting that you drink before the reincarnation that causes you to forget what you saw in the afterlife. Well, the story of is that he didn't drink and therefore was able to come back. And so with this story, what we have is this tale where he says that he describes it as approaching these judges, right? So he says he came to this awe-inspiring place where there were 4 openings, 2 into and out of the sky, and then 2 that go into and out of the ground. There were judges between these openings, and they ordered the souls which path they needed to follow. The good were guided into the path into the sky, the immortal then directed below. When approached the judges, he was told to remain and listen and observe what was going on in order to report this experience back to humankind. And meanwhile, from the other end of the sky, cleansed souls floated down that recounted beautiful sights and wondrous feelings. Those who remained from the underground appeared dirty, haggard, and tired, crying in despair when recounting their awful experiences, as each was required to pay a tenfold penalty for all the wicked deeds committed when they were alive. There were some who could not be released from the underground, and these were the murderers, the tyrants, and other vicious persons, criminals that were doomed to remain by the exit of the underground, but were unable to ever leave. After 7 days in this meadow, the souls that required, the souls and were required to travel further on. So after 4 days, they reached this place where they could see a shaft of rainbow light. And then we see a day's travel later, they actually reached it. This is called the spindle of necessity. So we kind of have this wheel that is a circular wheel of rainbow light. That's kind of the astral plane, so to speak. Then we find within this circle there's concentric circles, and these kind of relate to the management of the universe. And so you have in orbit 1 the stellar orbit of the stars, orbit 2 being Saturn, circle 3 being Jupiter, circle 4 being Mars, circle 5 being Venus, and then 6, 7, and 8 being, 7 and 8 being Sun and Moon, and of course the Earth at the center. So we have, curiously, a geocentric, well, I don't guess it's curious, but this geocentric model. And this spindle is called the spindle of necessity. And so in this cosmos, the spindle is attended by these sirens, who are the 3 daughters of the goddess Necessity, known collectively, of course, in mythology as the Fates. And their duty is to keep the rims of the spindle constantly revolving. So the Fates, these sirens, and the spindle are, described in here in the Republic as the means by which the stellar bodies revolve around the Earth in Plato's cosmology. And it's interesting because this comes up also in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where you have the notion of the spindle of necessity at the beginning of his accounts of the mythology, with the weaving of the web and the story of Athena. Now, these planetary spheres, will, of course, will match up to what we find in Aristotle's account of the celestial spheres, and then this would, of course, go on to influence cosmology for several centuries after that, until we reach the modern world, where we're told that none of this is true. Supposedly, I happen to think that a lot of this is still insightful and true, and I would direct anybody who wants to delve deeper into that question to the books by Wolfgang Smith, where he deals with cosmos, transcendence, and ancient cosmology. And those books are very good. They're also good critiques of scientism. So we have at the beginning this axis mundi, right, which is the center of the world or the universe, the pillar by which everything else turns. And this is, of course, an anthropic model that places man and creation at the center, with everything else revolving around it, because, of course, man, whether it's the biblical creation account or the Platonic view, man is sort of the pinnacle of creation underneath the gods, so to speak. And so it would be part of the purpose of the heliocentric model, or these other models of that would come to dominate in the modern period during the scientific revolution. The explicit purpose of some of these models is said to be propagandist, in that it's said to be the humbling, so to speak, of man, and removing him from a position of believing that he has a stewardship under God in terms of the created order. And if anyone doubts that, I would direct you to the book Freemasonry and the Birth of Modern Science by Robert Lomas, who is an apologist for this perspective, and he actually goes through the history of the Royal Society and its promotion of this model of a cosmology to dethrone man in the interests of so-called science, right? Now, this is really hard to kind of dissect, and I think that many scholars, as I've looked up secondary research on this, have a hard time exactly making sense of all of the details of what is going on here. But it's very similar to John's account in ways of the afterlife, or of heaven, I guess, so to speak, the New Jerusalem, where the Lamb is surrounded by a circular rainbow throne, or the dance of creation, so to speak, that follows the Lamb in John's Apocalypse. And so I found that very interesting, that the note here in my book says the spindle of necessity seems to be a twisting device, and so the extremities of the lights, the strings of light, enter into the universe, just as the strings enter the trireme, which is the part of the spindle. The spindle must be attached to these extremities so that the spinning tightens the light and holds the universe together. The light is thus like two rainbows around the universe, or the whirl of a spindle, whose ends enter the universe and are attached to the spindle. The upper half of the whirl of the spindle consists of concentric hemispheres that fit together into one another, with the lips or rims fitting together into a single plane. The outer hemisphere is that of the fixed stars, etc., etc. So we have the Earth in at the center. And what is the point of all this? Well, it's a musical universe. And so we read that there is a connection to music here, where he says, Plato writes in section 617, the concord of the 8 notes produced a single harmony. Up and above, on each of the rims of the circle, stood a siren, who, in accordance with its revolution, uttered a single sound or note. So you have this vibrational singing of the different spheres into existence. This is, of course, perfectly in accord with Genesis 1 and the biblical creation account, which occurs through the Word of God, the Logos. Now, that's interesting because if you know about cymatics, then you know that cymatics shows that notes and musical vibrations will create geometrical forms and patterns. And that shows that the universe is thus constructed and sung into existence, so to speak, with the different frequency vibrations of the different levels of existence being the underlying framework or fabric of reality. Now, if that sounds wild or far out, just look up the videos that you'll find on cymatics, cymatics, and that makes perfect sense with the account of both of Genesis 1 and of what Plato's discussing here. So, whether it sounds far out or not, doesn't matter. It's true. Now, you're not going to hear that ever mentioned in terms of modern so-called science because it's not interested in those things. I think that's a pretty neat scientific fact and discovery, wouldn't you say? Yet, according to modern so-called science, no, none of that matters. We should not concern ourselves with such things. But it does lend credence to the idea that reality does seem to be structured such that there are these different frequencies and vibrational notes, so to speak, that keep things in the form that they have. And so this is behind the idea of why Nikola Tesla could break glass by beaming a certain note at glass, by which he would cause the molecular stability of the glass to become unstable and shatter. So that's just another example of this principle at work. And so the universe is held together by this kind of harmony. Also kind of shows the Pythagorean influence here on Plato, because the Pythagoreans, of course, attached mystical significance not merely to numbers and geometrical forms, but also to notes, because, of course, music, as we learn in the quadrivium, is mathematics in time, and geometry is, of course, mathematics in space. So the story goes on to recount some different tales of people who were reincarnated, Orpheus choosing to be reincarnated as a swan, curiously, and the spinning of the spindle in the waters of forgetfulness, as we said. And then at the end of the Republic, we have the statement that the purpose of this book of the Republic and everything that was said here, and of the goal of the ideal Republic, is that both in this life and in the 1,000-year journey afterwards, we will do well, receive our just rewards, and be happy. So kind of a almost Solomonic notion here, right? If you've read Ecclesiastes, Solomon says, what is the end of this? To serve God and love your fellow man, operate justly, etc., etc. But it's curious that there is the notion of a final judgment here, which is also, of course, included in the book of the Apocalypse. So we almost kind of have an apocalyptic ending. I don't mean apocalypse in the sense of like end of the world, but I'm saying an apocalyptic ending in the sense of similarities to imagery in John's Apocalypse. Now, I'm not sure what to make of that, other than that perhaps there's just this underlying prophetic impetus or seed within creation itself that kind of points to these things. And that from the traditional Christian perspective, what you have in these perennial myths and stories, or in the tradition of Platonism or in traditionalism, etc., is the seeds of truth, yet corrupted, right? So in other words, at the beginning of time, you have this body of tradition, the true religion, so to speak, the true tradition passed down, and then because of the movement of peoples and cultures and events that you see, for example, in the book of Genesis, you have the corrupting of this tradition in different locations. However, if you believe the Bible or the book of Genesis and so forth, then you would believe that there is the preservation of the true tradition through the seed of Abraham and so forth, all the way up to the penultimate seed of Abraham, which would be, of course, Jesus, the Logos. So that would constitute the true tradition, and then you would have elements or seeds of this tradition mentioned elsewhere, the Sibylline oracles, or the elements within Plato that seem to match up. Yet we find it, of course, disfigured and jumbled up with myths and paganism. Nevertheless, we can, of course, I think, find seeds of truth there. So then we should mention, of course, later Platonic thought, as I said, which is embodied in the laws. And in the laws, we have this kind of reformatting of what we saw in Plato's Republic. And this reformatting will constitute a more pragmatic approach than the kind of mythological and metaphysical elements that we saw in Plato's Republic, so published much earlier in Plato's career. So you've been listening to Jay's analysis break down the final book, Book 10 of the Republic, as well as doing a recap of the entire work, which we've done in this series. And if you like what you hear, then if you want to hear hour 2, go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe for $4.95 a month, where you get access to my full talks, lectures, and interviews. And it's very much a growing archive and resource. So I would encourage you, if you're listening to this podcast or this talk, to support the work that I do and go there and buy it. Also, check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood, which can be ordered from Trine Day Books. You can Google Trine Day and you'll find Esoteric Hollywood. Or if you go to jaysanalysis.com, you'll see links to my book there. You'll see the cover of my book. You click on that and it'll take you over to Trine Day, where you can order with credit card or PayPal. So in hour 2, we're going to continue with Plato's notion of the ideal state and his sort of reformulation and reformatting in his book, The Laws. We're not going to deal with all the laws, but we're going to talk about it because it relates to the Republic. So Republic Part 2, right? The Empire Strikes Back, and Plato's idea of Magnesia being ruled by the Nocturnal Council. We're also going to talk about the mystic rites in relation to Plato, right? The ancient mysteries, and how the mystery religions, Pythagoreanism, and the Orphic tradition were a tremendous influence on Plato as well. And so we're going to get some deep esoteric stuff in part 2, so stay tuned for that. And if you are not a subscriber, subscribe and you'll get that full talk. So you've been listening to Jay's Analysis. Thank you.